the plugs and keyboards and everything that you need, office equipment, lighting, and so forth that you need, copy machines for a new office. And let's suppose he needs to raise some capital for that, and so somebody in Japan has saved up money and wants to invest. And so the agreement they reach is, he says, oh, the American entrepreneur says, all right, if you lend me, he's got yen initially, he converts into dollars, if you lend me $100,000 to start my business, I'm going to use that to buy all sorts of office equipment, maybe some of which he's buying from Japanese producers, and then in exchange you'll own, let's say, 50% of my company. All right, so you're not actually getting anything tangible from me today. I'm giving you stock certificates, or I'm giving you some sort of agreement that says you'll get 50% of any future net income that this firm generates. All right, so that transaction, once all is said and done, once he gets the money and then uses it to buy office equipment, some of which is from Japan, that would have increased the American trade deficit with Japan. Because if you think about it, there would have been, if you stand back and look at that, what would have happened, there would have been copy machines and computers flowing across the ocean from Japan to the United States, and there wouldn't have been any Japanese people buying U.S. products. And so they said, oh man, these profligate Americans are crazy. They're just, getting awash in debt here, that they're just buying goods today in promising away future earnings to pay for it. All right, so that's, whereas if looking at the individual transaction, it doesn't seem that that's actually very short-sighted. It actually seems that that's productive, and that's what we want people to do. All right, now, having said that, it doesn't mean anytime there's a trade deficit that that's a good thing, and I'm not saying that Americans shouldn't save more. I think probably they should, in terms of, if I want to be paternalistic and give people free advice that's worth the price that I'm charging for it, yeah, I would say you probably should save more, But it's not that a trade deficit per se is a signal of something bad. One last observation on trade deficits to try to see that is that if you go to these websites like FRED, the St. Louis Fed website, or these other, the BEA, and you look at the trade deficit over time and you see the graph, well, from your view it look like this, and a lot of times if you're familiar with these economic charts, they have columns that are shaded, and then it'll say in the legend, shaded regions indicate recession as defined by the BEA or whatever. And if you look at the trade deficit, that number, the line typically goes down in those shaded regions and goes up when it's not shaded. So what that means is the trade deficits historically drops during recessions and rises during growth. And not only is that sort of irrelevant, but it's actually, that makes sense, because what happens for a sort of capital-intensive country like the United States is, when our economy is booming, when people feel like they have more disposable income and they're willing to make more purchases, naturally that's what you would expect, is that we buy more manufactured goods and services, consumption services, from the rest of the world, while they're investing more in the United States. Right? That happens during periods of growth. When there's a recession, people are afraid to spend. That's when we buy less from the rest of the world, and so the trade deficit drops. Okay, so it's not merely that the trade deficit is harmless. From a certain point of view, at least for capital-rich countries, a trade deficit might actually go hand in hand with economic growth. A lot of, I think, the reason that the trade deficit is considered to be a bad thing is just the term, deficit. But a trade deficit, the way these accounts are calculated, is equivalent to a capital surplus, a capital account surplus. Okay, a way to see it, it's easier if you think about it in terms of gold, because with different currencies changing against each other, that's one more thing you got to keep track of. But just imagine the world used gold, and foreigners wanted to invest more in U.S. companies than we wanted to invest in foreign companies on net. Well, what would that mean? That would mean more gold was flowing in than flowing out in terms of investment. And so that means Americans, if they wanted to, could use that gold to buy more manufactured goods and services from the rest of the world. And that could happen year after year, and it's not that all of a sudden we would run out of gold one day. Forget for the moment that gold isn't the measure of your wealth anyway, but even if it were, it's not that you would all of a sudden run out of gold. It's just that, on the manufactured and services side, your deficits were being counterbalanced by the fact that foreigners were investing more in your country. Okay, so the man on the street, if you said, do you think the U.S. should have a trade deficit or a surplus? He'd say, a surplus. And then if you said, okay, and would you prefer that foreigners invested more capital in here, or that on net capital was flowing out of our country? He'd say, I want capital flowing in. Well, you can't have both at the same time. All right, so you can pick one or the other, but you can't have a net trade deficit or net trade surplus and a capital account surplus. That's an accounting impossibility. All right, so I propose that instead of calling it a trade deficit, we should call it a capital account surplus. And then people say, oh, no, the capital account surplus is higher this month. And no, people would be happy that the capital account surplus is higher, and so maybe just that change in terminology would help. Okay, moving along, the third myth is that a lot of people think trade only helps the poorer countries, so that there's two countries trading, and I think most people would admit, okay, somebody's better off when people voluntarily trade things, but it's the poorer party, and that the rich country is somehow worse off. I think a good illustration of this viewpoint was when Pat Buchanan I think it was when he was running for president the first time, and I think it was when he was still on Crossfire, or at least a frequent guest on that show, and he was denouncing NAFTA, and again, it was difficult because I agreed with him that NAFTA was bad, but not for his reasoning behind it. And one of I think it might have been Michael Kinsley, I was glad that he tried to really nail Buchanan down on the point, and he said, okay, you're right, there's all these environmental regulations and it's conceding sovereignty to these international bodies, but forget all of that. Just suppose it really were a pure free trade document. Would you support it? And Buchanan paused and they said, no, I wouldn't, because it would merge our economy with Mexico's and that would lower American living standards. All right, so I really think he encapsulated there this fear people have. They think that having a wall between us, if just an imaginary wall in terms of economic policy, between us and really poor countries somehow shields us from their poverty and it keeps us richer, right? There's an idea that there's a certain amount of heat in the world, and if we got to keep it in. If we mix with a really cold country, that there's going to be a leveling out, and I think that's the mentality. Now, there's again with the time I have, I want to leave some time at the end for question and answer. I can't get into it too much, but just a few ways to see why that's silly. If just on an individual level. Can you imagine you're talking with your friend who's a lawyer, and you say, hey, you want to go to Taco Bell? And he said, no, sorry, I can't go in there. He goes, why? Do you know what the average wage of the people in there is? Right now I make $180,000 a year. If I go in there, my salary might get cut in half. Right? Okay, so we can see how that's silly, but so how is that any different from, let's say, Mexicans are poorer than we are. If we trade with them, it's going to pull down our wages. All right. Now, I don't know this because I'm a good imperialist American that I have been to very few foreign countries. I can't even find Kuwait on a map. And so I haven't been abroad, and I'm just curious, maybe some of you later on can enlighten me. Is it the case that in truly poor countries, are they all ardent free traders? Like, do they have the same economic fallacies we do, but they think, since we're poor, why don't we screw all these rich countries by trading with them, and like suck some of their wealth? I don't know. My guess is probably, since they're poor and backward, that they have bad economic ideas, and they're probably afraid of free trade as well. And you could get into it just to give you a hint as to, okay, we can see the absurdity in the view, but what actually is wrong with it? It's that it's not just low wages, for example. It's not that, the reason, if we allow Mexican firms to send us products, since they can pay their workers so little, therefore our wages all have to sink. It's not just the pure wage level, it's also the productivity. And so if our workers are twice as productive as